So I'll fit the shutter back, we'll see if it works. It's got to be taken apart for servicing anyway, but I'm interested to see if it would have worked to some extent. Not quite. Let's move that another tooth or so. Let's try it there. Well, it works, but it's incredibly slow. That shutter still hasn't closed. It's ticking away. Okay, so even had the shutter cocking rack worked, which of course it didn't because it was failed, the shutter was not going to work, so the camera was going to require work regardless. So just as well it came here. I'll remove the rear group, remove the front group, remove the shim rings, it's a bit stuck in place. Oh, it's a paper one, and a metal one here too. There we go. And you've got the shutter itself. Well, we're missing a screw there, as I'd already noted. And that flash contact's a bit distorted. We'll start taking this apart. Let that screw out. This screw out. Back this screw out a bit. Slide the outer shroud out, off. Here's the curved rack and the curved pusher that the rack moves, which then acts on the shutter. At the front, one small screw here that locks the retainer ring in place. It's a retainer ring. The lens mount, the detents there for the shutter speeds, the aperture setting numbers, the shutter speed settings ring. This is the coupling for the aperture settings numbers, shutter speed setting cam plate, and we're in. This is the latch that stops you being able to depress the shutter if the shutter's not cocked. Lift out the shutter release. Lift out this internal cocking ring, unhook its spring, unhook the pinion, arm that, cock that, and do the two screws holding the retard gear train in position. A single screw holds the delay action or self timer. Unhook the main spring. It's quite tired, but it'll still work. Remove the main cam. Drop that. Unhook that spring. Remove that screw. Remove that screw. off that plate, lift off that, release that, lift off that. Pliers I need. Unhook that spring. Lift out that sector gear. Lift out that little wheel that drives the pallets. Screw here that holds the B lever in place, and the spring acts on the arm here for cocking, for setting the self timer. Now that spring got away. It was a bit distorted and it was unhooked and it got away, so I have to find that. Here's the B lever. Here's the B lever spring. Now I'll unhook this spring. Nothing else odd looking going on there. Open the shutter up from the back. 3 screws hold the aperture setting lever in place. Move that, remove the shim, remove the lever. 3 screws hold the mechanism plate and the shutter case together. Lift off the shutter case. There's the diaphragm blades. They're not particularly oily. A lot of fingerprints on there that have etched into that surface. Probably to polish that. Flip out the diaphragm. Quick look at those blades. They're all relatively clean. The shutters blades. Well, I think our slow and sticky shutter problem is here on the mechanism plate. That blade actuating ring is pretty sluggish to move. I think that's probably where the main problem was. The blades don't look particularly oily. I don't think they were stuck together. Let's have this apart. So what's sticking this? Well, grease. It's the old grease that was used to lubricate that was sticking that. So it was probably graphite grease, but the medium that the graphite's suspended in has simply dried up over time and gone quite viscous and sticky. So it'll all have to be cleaned away, and most likely there'll be no problem once it's all removed. You can see how much is coming off here. Let's have a look at the mechanism plate itself. There's a fair bit's been plonked on here. Most of it on non-contact surfaces, doing absolutely nothing useful except gumming things up. Some technicians were in the habit of buttering up every available surface with graphite grease, and things probably worked very well for some length of time until the grease got old and dried out, like this, where it ceases to become a useful thing and becomes an impediment. Alright, let's pop that back together and see how it behaves. That detent spring's got a bit of a crimp mark right in the middle of it. I'm not sure what that's from. It could be from manufacturing. I don't know whether it would cause any problems. It's certainly quite a sharp crimp mark on that spring. There's 3 screws here. One of them is longer than the other 2. You need to make sure it goes back in the right place. And the right place for the longest screw is here, where the bracket for the main spring hooks up. And the longest screw is to account for the thickness of the bracket. It's probably about 1/4 of a millimetre, something of that range. I'm just checking the action of this. Yeah, it's instantly freer than it was previously, and all we've done is remove grease, not add lubricant. So I'll lubricate this with some graphite powder, which I prefer to use for that application because it doesn't get sticky with age, and then deal to the diaphragm, I suppose. There are other ways of lubricating something like this with graphite. You can just use pencil lead, and you can lubricate the blade actuating ring before you drop it back in place. Here I'm just using some graphite powder, and that'll work its way in between the surfaces. I'll just blow away the excess. Pop that back out of the way. Yeah, that moves nice and freely now. That's good. Well, we've got the detent there. And that needs to be lubricated with a touch of molybdenum paste. That can be a a high friction point right on there. Well, that's very good. That moves very nicely now. That's a good improvement. So the diaphragm, I want to clean the case first, and then the diaphragm components. And reassemble that. So all this needs just to be swabbed with cotton buds and naphtha, just to remove all the traces of old grease and dust and grit that may have accumulated. The video camera battery just ran out of go and some things just stopped. So I'll finish getting this case clean to my satisfaction. Put that to one side. Let's work on these bits and pieces. The retainer plate, I think I already mentioned that this was somewhat embossed with fingerprints that have etched into the surface. That makes the surface rough, and so the shutter blades in particular may not fly across that surface as quickly as you might like. So I'm going to polish this with a bit of metal polish. You can see, let's get that in the light. Yeah, you can see the corrosion here and matching corrosion on this side, and that's where someone's grabbed it like this, and their perspiration and skin oils have simply etched into the metal. Just clumsy handling, really. That could have happened at any stage. I've taken apart shutters that were new old stock, so they were fresh from the decor factory apart from their 60-year wait in various people's cupboards, and they had problems like that. So things like that sort of behaviour, that could have happened anywhere at any time when someone's been servicing or even assembling the shutter the first time round. I'll polish that and be back. Well, I've got that retainer plate clean now, comparatively free of fingerprints, and it'll probably work absolutely fine. It took a bit of work with Brasso to get that clean, and just get these diaphragm blades in place. The diaphragm blades I've already cleaned as well, just with naphtha. They didn't require any polish. They appeared to be fine. Just get the last of the blades in place. Bit of bounce to that, it might not be exactly flat. Okay. Put the settings piece in place. That's the piece that swings left and right and swings the diaphragm blades open or close. Put the case on. The case only goes on in one direction. Give that a wriggle, make sure it's seated. Flip my jig over, pop that underneath. Fit the three screws for the retainer plate. That one doesn't want to go in for one reason or another. We'll encourage it. That's better. Alright, check that the blades all appear to be present and correct and seated. Check that they move. They do. Nip those three screws up. Check again. It does move. It moves quite freely. There's a little bit of friction there, more friction there than I'd like. I might put a bit of graphite powder on here and work that in. The blades themselves I know are clean, but I think that should move a little bit freer than that. I'll just tip a bit of graphite powder in there, let that drop into those. Oh, that's probably why. There's a little thread of cotton in there which may have been clogging things up. Let's just work that in. Because this is all clean and dry, there won't be a problem with the graphite powder clumping up and sticking anywhere. It'll simply rub on to mating surfaces, and if I blow that excess out, everything should be very good. That appears to be fine. That's very smooth, moves very easily. That's all I need it to do. Our mechanism plate, which I previously cleaned, we'll check, put that into the blade's open position. I'll just give that one wipe of naphtha in case I've picked up any dust or anything on there while it's been sitting on the bench. No, that looks fine. And fit the shutter blades in place. Starting here. The shutter blades I have polished with Brasso. They weren't badly marked, but they were marked, so I thought while I had the Brasso out, I might just as well do the blades. in the picture still only just. A terrible habit of drifting off camera. Right, the shutter case goes over the top. It only goes in one position. There it is. And there are 3 retainer screws that hold the mechanism plate and the case together. I'll put these in, I'm only doing them up very lightly. Just in case one of those blades became dislodged while I was lifting the case over the top of the mechanism plate. I don't want to get a blade trapped between one of the pins and the case. That all appears fine. I can nip those 3 screws up. That all looks good. Those blades are nice and clean, look exactly as they should do, and everything moves very smoothly indeed, and the diaphragm the same. Good. Okay, I can start assembling some of the other components or springs onto the mechanism plate first. Springs are always a bit fraught because they're keen to get away sometimes. I fish out these springs from my container. Alright. Okay, I'll just manoeuvre these into place. Alright, just lift up the tail of this spring and swing it over the top, lift it up over the top of an obstruction and hook it behind another pin. Yes, that works, and now that's sprung loaded and that's sprung loaded. Here's the spring for the B lever that goes around a groove on that post. Just check that it's seated, it appears that it is. I'll open the shutter blades fully and set the B lever in position. Hook it into its return spring and drop it over its pillar. There we go. And here we have the screw that holds that in place and the spring that was fitted to the screw. The spring that took off into the distance when I took the shutter apart. And that's because the spring was not correctly seated and it was slightly misshapen. That's good. Tighten that screw. Check the B lever moves correctly. It all appears fine. That's good. That spring is seated correctly. No, that looks fine. Hold back the B lever. I can pull the mechanism, the blade actuating ring back to the park position. Okay, I'm ready to start putting the other bits and pieces on the mechanism plate now.